Imagine, if you will, the lower tip of Manhattan Island in the 1820s, when the day is fading and the street lamps have just begun to tremble into amber life. The cobblestones still hold a faint warmth from the afternoon sun, and a boy stands at the edge of a wooden wharf, breathed on by the tide. His name is Herman Melville, and he is 8 years old. Above him, the masts of tall ships sway like a thin forest against a sky that is slowly turning from pale gold to the deepest violet. Sea air mixes with the smells of tar, hemp rope, and the distant sweetness of bakeries. He watches the water, a sheet of dark silk beneath the emerging stars, and feels an unnamed longing, the first quiet pull of the ocean before he even knows what an ocean means. Everything in this moment is still, suspended in that peculiar hush between the day's activity and the evening's rest. The warehouses behind him are already locked, their brick facades softened by the blur of dusk. A few sailors pass on foot, their voices low, their boots thudding gently on the planks. This is a city that lives by the sea, and the sea is breathing right against its doorstep. Herman was born on August 1st, 1819, at 6, Pearl Street, into a family whose fortunes had once been bright but were now beginning to flicker. His father, Alan Melville, then still spelling the name without the final E, was an importer of French dry goods, a man of charm and fine taste who loved travel books and the latest European fashions. Their parlor, in those early years, was furnished with mahogany chairs, a small pianoforte, and shelves of calfskin volumes whose spines caught the firelight in the evenings. Young Herman would curl up on a woven rug and listen to his father read aloud from travel narratives and sea adventure stories, the words rolling out like a gentle tide. The light in the room came from oil lamps and the hearth, casting long, softly moving shadows across the wallpaper. Outside, the city murmured with the sound of horse-drawn carts, but inside there was only the warmth of family, the rustle of pages, the strong but tender voice of a father who saw in his second son a dreamy, observant spirit. These evenings planted the first seeds of wonder in Herman's mind, the sense that the world was wider than Pearl Street and that words could carry you across it. But the family's prosperity, like the light at dusk, was not meant to last. Alan Melville's business began to struggle under the weight of debts and the changing economy after the Panic of 1819. By the time Herman was 11, the furniture had grown a little sparser, the lamps fewer, and the family had moved to more modest lodgings. There was a quiet sadness that settled over the household, a new kind of silence in the evenings when there was less to read and less to hope for. Herman was old enough to notice the change, but young enough not to understand its full shape. He sensed it in his mother's tired eyes, in the way his father walked more slowly up the stairs. Still, there was always the harbor, always the ships, and Herman would sneak away to the wharves whenever he could. He would stand and watch the longshoremen unload crates of tea and silk, the whole dockside animated by a calm, rhythmical industry. The light on the water in those afternoons was a pale, watery gold, the kind of light that makes everything look nostalgic even as it is happening. It was a light that would follow him all his life. When Herman was 12, the family crossed over to Albany, seeking a new beginning up the Hudson River. The journey itself was a quiet procession of water and green banks. They traveled on a river sloop, a sturdy vessel with a single mast and a long, low deck where Herman could sit and watch the landscape unroll like a painted scroll. The Hudson in those days was lined with thick forests and occasional farmhouses, their windows just beginning to glow in the late afternoon. He heard the lapping of water against the hull, the creak of the boom, and the occasional call of a shore bird. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. This ride up the river was a gentle bridge between two chapters of his young life, the bustling maritime world of New York and the quieter, provincial atmosphere of Albany. In the evenings on that boat, the stars seemed larger and closer, and Herman would lie on his back looking up at them, feeling the whole universe breathe around him. It was a moment of pure, unbroken peace, a sleepiness that did not ask for sleep, but simply for presence. Albany, in the 1830s, was a dignified old Dutch town of gabled roofs, tree-lined streets, and brick churches whose bells told the hours with a soft, meditative cadence. The Melville family's new home was a modest house on a quiet lane, where Herman shared a room with his older brother Gansford. He attended the Albany Academy for a time, a sturdy stone building with tall windows that let in great shafts of daylight. In the classroom, he bent over his slate or listened to lessons in Latin and rhetoric, but his mind often drifted back to the waterfront scenes of his childhood. He was a handsome boy, thoughtful, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a question. After school, he would wander down to the Albany docks, a much smaller affair than those of New York, but still busy enough with canal boats and river sloops. There he would watch the cargo of the Erie Canal being transferred, barrels of flour, bushels of wheat, the honest produce of the interior making its way to the sea. The light here was softer than in Manhattan, filtered through a canopy of elms that lined the riverbank. It was a gentle world, quiet and slow, and yet the boy who stood on the dock was already dreaming of the great oceans beyond the bend. The deepest shadow of Herman's youth fell when his father, Allen, after a series of business failures and worsening health, died in 1832. Herman was only 12, and the loss carved a hollow space into the family's daily life that was never quite filled again. The funeral took place on a gray winter morning, the air so cold that breath turned to mist. Afterward, the house grew very still. His mother, Maria, did her best to keep the household together, but the warmth of those early fireside evenings was replaced by a quieter, more anxious tone. Herman had to leave school and find work, first as a clerk in a bank, where he copied out letters by the watery light of a window that overlooked a courtyard. The job was tedious, but it taught him the discipline of sitting alone with his thoughts, the ink flowing in neat lines across the page. In the evenings, he would still find time to read Shakespeare, the Bible, tales of the sea. He began to carry a small notebook, jotting down his observations. In those lonely, lamplit hours, the boy who had once listened to his father's voice began to develop his own. By the time Herman was 17, the family had moved back to the Albany area after a brief stay in Lansingburg, and the young man had grown tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet intensity that older folks found promising. He took up school teaching for a season in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a countryside of rolling hills and neat white farmhouses. The one-room schoolhouse sat on a ridge that looked out over a green valley dotted with sheep. In the mornings, the sunlight poured through the dusty window panes and the children's voices rose in simple lessons. Herman boarded with a local family, his room a small attic space beneath the eaves, where he could hear the wind moving through the maples. In the evenings, he would walk along the country lanes, watching the fireflies blink in the tall grass, the whole world hushed and sweet. It was a life of wholesome routine, and yet the old desire for the sea had never left him. The horizon from those hills seemed too close. He wanted to see what lay beyond it, to feel a ship's deck beneath his feet and a salt wind on his face. So when his teaching term ended, he packed his small trunk, said goodbye to the peaceful valley, and made his way back toward the coast, toward a new beginning that would reshape everything he knew. On a bright June morning in 1839, Herman Melville, now 19, walked up the gangplank of a merchant ship named the St. Lawrence, which was moored at a wharf on the East River. The air smelled of tidewater and fresh paint, and a gentle breeze ruffled the collar of his coat. He carried a small sea chest and a heart full of yearnings stitched together from everything he had ever read about the Atlantic. The ship, a square-rigged packet, was destined for Liverpool, and Herman had shipped as a common sailor, what seamen called a boy. The deck was scrupulously clean, scrubbed with sandstone until the wood shone a pale honey color in the morning light. Tall masts rose above him, their rigging intricate as a spider's web against the clear sky. As the lines were cast off and the vessel began to slide away from the pier, Herman stood at the rail and watched his native city shrink to a cluster of spires and rooftops, then a hazy line, then nothing at all. He felt the deck come alive under him, a slow, rhythmic lift and fall that was the heartbeat of the deep. Life aboard the St. Lawrence settled quickly into the gentle discipline of a merchant ship. The crew was small and workmanlike, men of few words who moved with the unconscious grace of those who have spent years balancing on moving wood. Herman learned to haul on a rope, to coil it neatly, to climb the shrouds when the mate called. The most peaceful hours came during his watches at night, when he was stationed at the bow or the helm, and the only sounds were the creak of the tiller, the rush of water along the hull, and the vast, enveloping silence of the open Atlantic. On clear nights the stars burned with an intensity he had never seen from land, a thick powder of light that seemed close enough to touch. He would lean his elbows on the rail and watch the phosphorescence trail behind the ship, a soft green glow that swirled like liquid moonlight in the wake. Those hours of solitude and darkness nourished something deep inside him, a contemplative habit that would later fill the pages of his greatest book. The sea, he discovered, was not a place of constant danger, but of long, meditative stillness punctuated by brief moments of orderly action. After a voyage of several weeks, the St. Lawrence approached the coast of England, and Herman got his first view of the Old World through a fine, silver mist that rose from the water. The green hills of Wales came into view first, soft and rounded like the backs of sleeping animals. Then the ship entered the Mersey River, gliding past an endless procession of buoys, fishing smacks, and pilot boats, until the great port of Liverpool unfolded before them. The docklands were a forest of spars and chimneys, a dense weave of brick and smoke that seemed both marvelous and oppressive. Herman walked the streets of Liverpool in the afternoons, absorbing the strange mixture of grandeur and poverty. He saw ancient, half-timbered buildings leaning together as if sharing secrets, their plaster facades weathered to a quiet, dignified gray. In the public squares, fountains played in the golden light of late summer, and he could hear the tolling of church bells and the cries of street vendors. It was his first taste of a foreign land, and it entered him not as excitement, but as a slow, deep wonder and awareness that the world held an infinite variety of human life, each corner lit by its own particular light. One incident from that first voyage, which Herman would later transform into literary material, took place inside a Liverpool boarding house, where he saw a young woman working at a sewing machine in a dim back room. She was thin, pale, and utterly silent, her fingers moving mechanically hour after hour. The room had a single sooty window that let in a tired, gray light. Herman did not speak to her. He only watched for a moment, and that image planted itself in his memory like a seed. It was a quiet scene of labor and isolation, not dramatic but deeply human. In the years to come, he would learn to draw upon such small, still pictures, the things seen but not immediately understood, and give them voice. In the evenings, he would sit on a Liverpool pier, watching the sunset color the water in shades of orange and rose, and the whole busy port would slowly hush. The lamps ashore began to glow, their reflections wobbling on the darkening tide, and he would think about the distance he had traveled, not just in miles, but in the expansion of his own young soul. The return voyage to New York was a quiet mirror of the earlier crossing. The ship, now loaded with cargo, rode lower in the water, and the familiar rhythm of the sea felt like a lullaby. By now Herman had gained his sea legs and a small measure of confidence. The captain, a kindly man named Griswold, noticed the young sailor's intelligence and sometimes invited him to join the officers' mess, where the conversation turned to literature, politics, and the wonders of distant oceans. Talking with educated men under the soft glow of the cabin lamp, Herman felt that the world of letters was not entirely closed to him, that a person of humble beginnings might still earn a place at the table through observation and honest labor. On the last night before reaching Sandy Hook, there was a full moon that turned the sea to beaten silver. He stood the mid-watch alone, the ship gliding through that luminous expanse as if it were sailing across a mirror of heaven. The air was perfectly still, the sails barely drawing, and all the bells of the watch had gone quiet. In that vast, silent radiance, Herman Melville understood something about the soul's capacity for solitude, and he was not afraid of it. When the St. Lawrence was made fast once more at a New York pier, Herman stepped ashore a changed young man. His skin was tanned, his hands harder, and his eyes carried a new depth, a look that had seen the open ocean and a foreign land. He rejoined his family, who were now living in Lansingburg, a small village on the upper Hudson. There, in a quiet house with a garden that sloped down to the river, he spent the autumn months telling stories of Liverpool, the sea, and the strange characters he had met. His sisters sat mending by the stove. His mother listened with a mixture of pride and worry, and Herman began to write some of these stories down. The parlor in the evenings was warm and close, the lamplight soft on his face as he bent over a makeshift desk. He wrote letters to magazines and tried his hand at a few sketches, but no publication came. Yet the act of writing itself felt right. It gave form to the images that had been swirling inside him, the phosphorescence, the mist over the Mersey, the silent girl at the sewing machine. He was beginning to understand that his true vocation lay not only in the seeing but in the shaping. Still, the land could not hold him long. The sea had planted a restlessness in him that no village garden could soothe. He signed on for a brief voyage to the Pacific aboard a whaler, but that fell through. Then, in the early winter of 1840, he traveled west by canal boat and stagecoach to visit an uncle in Galena, Illinois, seeing the vast, snow-covered interior of America, its plains, its frozen rivers, its small frontier towns huddled against the cold. The journey was long, and in the deep, muffled silence of a Midwestern winter night, with the stars hard and bright overhead, he felt the land's immensity as a kind of peace. He returned to the east with a firmer resolve. He would go a-whaling. The whale ship, he imagined, was the ultimate university for a man hungry for experience. On January 3, 1841, he stood on the wharves of New Bedford, Massachusetts, a young man of 21 gazing at the forest of whaling vessels preparing for voyages of 3 and 4 years. A cold salt wind blew from Buzzards Bay and the air smelled of oil and oakum. He signed the articles of the whaleship Acushnet, and as he put his name to the paper, he felt the quiet click of a door opening onto the unknown.